Hello, it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETchat, the UK's #1 leading veterinary podcast. I'm very pleased and delighted to tell you today that we've got Carri Westgarth on the line. Carri is a lecturer at Liverpool University where she lectures on animal welfare and the human-animal bond. We're going to be talking today about dog bites. So before we crack on with that, Carri, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself before we start?
Yeah, I can do. Thank you very much. I started in a zoology, genetics, animal behaviour background, and then moved into dog training and animal behaviour work. And I was an assistant dog trainer for a while, and I also worked in an animal rescue centre for a while. And then I came into research and did a PhD and trained in veterinary epidemiology and human public health, and has built a research portfolio from there all around the pets that we live with, mainly dogs, and why we live with them, what we do with them, how that impacts them, how they impact us. And then I also teach the veterinary undergraduate students in this area.
And, you know, as we were saying, that human-animal bond is so important, and a lot of the time that goes really well, but unfortunately we do see episodes where animals have to be, you know, destroyed because of biting or sent back to a rescue centre. And of course, you know, bites can be as not severe as, you know, a little scratch up to, unfortunately, I know we've had some deaths this year as well. You're obviously doing a lot of research around dog bites. And I know to start, it'd be really fascinating to hear about your virtual dog. We were talking about it before we came onto the podcast. We obviously did a virtual dog for anatomy as part of Hollow Vet. That was Shiva, the German Shepherd dog. But tell us a bit about Dave.
So yeah, Dave is a Labrador. So we went for quite a common generic breed that people would think would be quite friendly. And Dave stands for Dog Assisted Virtual Environment, which I think is probably the greatest creative moment of my career so far, to come up with that. So yeah, he's a virtual reality dog. Unfortunately, a lot of the virtual reality work we had planned got turned into kind of virtual, but not quite virtual reality because of COVID, because we couldn't do face-to-face research.
Yeah.
But we have piloted him as face-to-face, as well as used him in more online video formats as well for research purposes. So basically, he is either in the corner of a room or he's in the corner of a park. You can choose between the two environments, and he's standing there. And as you approach him, his behaviour changes. And so he basically moves through what we would call the ladder of aggression through some of those moves, lifting his paw up, turning his head away, doing yawning, licking his lips, moving backwards, until the point, if you go right up close to him and try to touch him, he will lunge and bite you. And we designed this for numerous reasons. We want a safe environment where we can test how people react to an aggressive dog. So it's safe for the people and it's safe for the dogs. No dogs are being harmed in the process of this research. But B, could it be used as an intervention for training people about body language of dogs when they're feeling unsure and worried? And then C, could it possibly be used as an intervention for people who have phobias of dogs to be able to be in a controlled virtual environment around a virtual dog as well? So it's in the very early stages. We're doing pilot research at this point, you know, exploring how people react to him. But we are hoping for more funding in this area, and there's been fantastic work done by James Oxley, my PhD student, and it was his idea in the first place. And, so really proud of that work he's been doing.
And it's brilliant that we're seeing more and more work done, which is very much evidence-based, because of course, you know, obviously I'm a vet and I have a feeling that I'm fairly intuitive around dogs, and thankfully, you know, didn't receive any sort of serious injuries while I was practicing. But of course, the danger with intuition is it's obviously not nearly as important as sort of evidence-based stuff, and we can end up with myths that get into the literature because somebody writes about it who's reasonably authoritative, and suddenly everybody talks about it. Do you think there are myths that need to be dispelled within this area of perhaps wisdom that's been passed down that is actually incorrect?
There are lots of myths around dog bites and dog bite prevention, I think. And some of them are actually around, they're not just common to dog bites, they're common myths around injury prevention. So they're common ways we perceive our risk of injury, and that are nothing to do with dogs, but we apply them to the dog situation as well. But it's kind of complicated even further by the dog situation, because they're not just an object that may harm us, they're an animal with our own relationship with that animal. So it's almost like another person. So, but there are lots of myths. So for example, that it wouldn't happen to me. So we all think, but dogs like me and I wouldn't get bitten. Or this dog wouldn't bite me because he knows me and he likes me, or my dog wouldn't bite anyone. It's other people's dogs that bite people. And actually none of that is true. Lots of, everybody thinks my dog wouldn't bite someone until their dog bites someone, and everybody thinks, oh, I'm not going to get bitten, I know what I'm doing, until they get bitten. So try not to fall into that trap, for sure. The other thing we do a lot is victim blaming. So, when someone has a car crash, we think, well, they must have been driving stupidly, for example. And with dogs, we tend to say, well, somebody did something wrong. The child jumped on the dog. The postal worker frightens the dog. All sorts of things. And I see this when I interview dog bite victims. Those quotes like, in every bite time I've ever been bitten, I've been to blame. I could have done something differently. And although, in hindsight, it's easy to think that. Interestingly, that woman was one who's she was walking a friend's dog that she was looking after, and that dog saw another dog and kicked off and was on the lead and redirected, basically just turned and bit her leg rather than obviously couldn't get to what he wanted. And actually you think it's quite hard in that situation to be doing anything different than standing there with the dog on the lead. So it's so interesting that she thought that was her fault.
It's also a bit embarrassing, because if that's a relationship, I had an uncle and aunt who the dog, you would walk in and it would just bark and bark, and if it got the chance it would try and bite you. Well, that was clearly a dog that needed to be managed better and differently, and I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just merely inhabiting its space, and maybe I shouldn't have inhabited its space. And in fact, funnily enough, I used to inhabit its space less and less because I went less, because it wasn't fun going. So this ends up where people become isolated, don't they? Because nobody wants to come to the house because they've got a nutty dog in the house. Yeah.
And we did a survey of dog bite victims, and about 35% of the dog bites occurred when someone was trying to interact with the dog in some way, but all of the others, they weren't actually really necessarily interacting with the dog. Sometimes they don't even know the dog is there. It just runs up behind them and bites them. So that idea that it's a natural instinct to want to think about what was happening during that very last moment before the bite occurred. But actually, in terms of injury prevention, what measures could be put in way before that moment of that interaction, even, in order to make sure that bite didn't occur. So, for example, we spoke earlier about the use of muzzles. That's something that if the dog was muzzle trained and was happy wearing a muzzle, before you even get to a situation where you're interacting with that dog, you have prevented that dog bite. Not around the way you're actually interacting with it. So it's kind of thinking a bit more widely than thinking, what did the victim do to cause this dog to bite them? Which is just a very, very narrow part of how we prevent dog bites from happening.
And I suppose also, even somebody who's had a dog for 10 years and suddenly that dog bites, that may be due to, for example, the dog has a sore hip, or it's becoming slightly senile, it can then act out of character because the person has touched it in a certain place that it's uncomfortable with.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, vets are on the very sharp end of this because a lot of animals are being brought in pain. Certainly when I'm looking through context of dog bites to children, quite a lot of them, it will note that the dog is fairly elderly now and has never done anything like this before. And the dog was lying there and the person tripped or something and fell on them, or even just, you know, gently brushed past them, and they're more reactive in that sense. And Daniel Mills at the University of Lincoln has done some fantastic work, and he around sort of pain and behaviour, and talking to him, he reckons that pretty much every behaviour problem he sees has some element of pain somewhere in the history. So I think this is vastly underestimated. And certainly when I had my own child and an elderly dog, when I had my child was a toddler, our dog was quite elderly at the time, and I was just aware that as much as she liked him, if she was just asleep and he accidentally fell on her, that was not going to end well, and that wouldn't have been anyone's fault but mine, really.
And I think this is where veterinary advice is very important, that you know, young children, anybody sort of under 7 or 8 really can't be left with a dog on their own, because even a small dog can deliver, you know, a life-changing injury to a face or whatever, can't they?
They can, and we've seen fatalities with very small breeds. We certainly see lots of very life-changing injuries, especially to children with very small breeds, very common breeds that you wouldn't think. So French bulldogs, Shih Tzus, pugs, cockapoos, they are all in this data. So yes, just because you think your dog is quite small and perhaps isn't therefore so much of a risk, it's just not worth it.
The Webinar Vet has been serving the veterinary community with CPD for over a decade, but did you know we offer so much more than just that? Our sister company, Simply Vets, have veterinary jobs all in one place. We serve the full veterinary team, providing permanent and locum roles in practice, whilst also providing a simple and transparent solution to IR35 where needed. We also care about the environment. That's why we plant trees for every one of our practice members. To find out more, please visit simplyvets.com today.
Talking about dog breeds, do you see in your research that there's certain types of dogs that are much more likely to bite?
So we did a systematic review of the literature, and we found no consistent evidence of breed effects. So even when there were studies that had found that some breeds were more at risk of being aggressive than others, or aggressive behaviour, the studies didn't agree with each other. So there was, across the studies, there was no consistency within that. Having said that, I think there is a difference between the risk of being aggressive. We know any dog can be aggressive in the right situation. You could push any dog to be aggressive, especially if it's in pain. But then there possibly is a difference as to how much damage it could do when it's aggressive, which is another tenet of injury prevention, is trying to limit the damage that occurs. So for example, seatbelts on cars, they don't stop us getting into accidents, but they limit, and airbags as another example, they limit the damage that can occur when an accident does happen. So yes, if you have a larger, powerful, energetic dog, perhaps we do need to be even more careful. The only consistent finding that we found in the literature was around genetics and heritability. So I'm not talking about
American Cockers.
Yes, there were some studies in Cocker Spaniels, but the studies would just happen to be in those breeds. So we're not talking about there being a high risk of certain breeds, but within lines, within breeds. So it's so important then that you are looking at the temperament of the lines, of the dam and the sire, and of the puppies that you're getting. Because although we think, oh, I'm a great owner and I'll do all the right things and I can fix this dog, actually, what you get, you can't change the genetics of it. You can't change that genetic history. And so that is so important. And we did a study with the Association of Pet Behaviour Counsellors, whom I'm a member of. We did a case control study with our members, and we found that if parents, so if owners hadn't seen the parents of the puppy compared to if they hadn't seen both parents, they were 4 times more likely to have behaviour problems later on. And if they hadn't seen one parent compared to seeing both parents, they were 2.5 times more likely. So basically seeing one parent is kind of good, but seeing both is much better in terms of that. And that links back, I think, to that genetic tendencies, that which is really hard, because this person, when they come in and they've got a dog that's aggressive, you can't rewind time and say, well, 10 years ago, where did you get this dog from, and what were the genetics and temperament of the parents? But I think as a society, this idea, there's no such thing as a bad dog, just a bad owner. Actually, you need to source a good dog in the first place as well.
Well, I know this was the American Cocker Spaniels. I don't know if names have been changed and things, but I remember meeting a few of these red cockers with rage syndrome, and whatever you did, they were just angry dogs.
Yeah, there's been a lot of controversy over the rage thing, and I don't know that we ever got to the bottom of it. Certainly we're seeing problems. I'm seeing reported problems with cockapoos now. But again, I think it's certain lines, or also coming from certain breeding establishments, in terms of behaviourists I know that are working with clients and having really young puppies. They're coming into a class as they're young puppies and they're already showing signs of aggression, and that is really quite worrying, because by that point the owner's not even had them long in order to have done anything to cause this.
No, it's interesting that you say it is lines, because of course I also know some really nice red cocker spaniels, but they seem to have something that was not right, and as you say, it's possibly just a line thing. Well, it probably is just a line thing.
But there was a lot of misdiagnosis as well. There was a lot of, I think at the time there was once things catch on, it was then it's rage, and it's like, no, it's a dog that's become really frightened of the person handling it because they cut its nail quick or something like that. And always look for the simpler explanation as well.
Yes, well, I know Mike Willard, who I always quote, one of famous gastroenterologists in America. He said, everything I taught you 10 years ago was a lie. So seeing as I haven't practiced for a little bit, I always preface things in case I'm a bit behind the curve on those. Finally, perhaps some tips for veterinary surgeons and nurses. We're handling dogs a lot. Are the things that in your research you've seen that vets and nurses have done that, and not wanting to victimize and say it's the victim's fault, but things that perhaps they have done that we shouldn't be doing, and how can we correct those? So perhaps 2 or 3 tips to finish.
Yeah, I think firstly, make yourself very behaviorally aware in terms of what are those signs that a dog is looking stressed and worried about a situation. It can be subtle. There are lots of great training courses, even YouTube clips people have made about these things, and we can all learn more. But hopefully you're fairly experienced with dogs, and a lot of this stuff's not necessarily taught in great depth in vet school training, or wasn't in the past. The other thing is learning low stress handling techniques. I think a lot of the traditional handling techniques, or the techniques that we've just got used to doing because that's the way it's just easy to do it, can actually be a bit overwhelming for some dogs. So is there anything you can improve in terms of leaning over the dog, how much the dog is being restrained and things? If you are have any concerns whatsoever, get a muzzle on. Safety first. Get someone who's really good at restraint as well. So a lot of vets get caught out, and vet students get caught out when dogs are coming around from anaesthetics. They let their guards down and maybe put their face in too close at this point, and the dog can suddenly move. So we see that quite a bit in the data. Yeah, quite a few things there
I think,
to think about.
one of the things I was always very keen on was having a nurse hold the dog rather than an owner, because owners don't always hold that well. They can let go and things. So
it's a difficult one, that. It is difficult, because is that going to stress the dog out more?
Yeah. Keep the owner in sight,
yes.
So that the dog was seeing the owner, but perhaps if I didn't really trust the owner, then I felt better to trust the nurse.
Yeah. The other thing to think about, finally, just to mention, is this idea of, I think when we're working with animals a lot, I've done a lot of jobs with animals and daily looking after animals in kennels and things. We do learn an intuition about how things are happening, what we're observing, and we may not always be conscious of that intuition, but something tells us something's a bit off, which can be really helpful. But also that intuition can let us down by making us a bit too complacent and trusting at times, in particular if we've known a dog for a long time, or we've dealt with a lot of dogs that look and been behaving like that dog right now. And this idea again of coming back to, it's not going to happen to me, or that dog's not going to bite, it's never bitten before. And even so my PhD student Sarah, she worked a lot in shelters and with interviewing veterinary professionals, and she found that even when a dog's behaving in a way that actually is showing that it's maybe not happy in this situation, because it's never hurt us before, or we know that dog quite well, we can be a bit too trusting with that. And just keep your wits about you. How is this happening right now? Because this is a different day, and this dog could react differently this day than it has before. Because it's social relationships we have with this animal. We do build up this trust with them, which is lovely, but that can let us down when it comes to being on our wits about the potential for a dog bite to occur.
Carri, that's been really brilliant. I think it's such an important area. The work that you're doing is fantastic, so please carry on doing it. I think it's really important also, because I can't remember ever having a lecture about dog bites at university, so the fact that we're beginning to talk about that to the students is fantastic. So thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been VETchat. Great to see you, and hopefully see you on a podcast or a webinar very soon. Bye-bye.